Welcome to the Note Investor Podcast. We'll guide you through the ups and downs of note investing and teach you all about the nitty-gritty details of the business that other people won't talk about. Your host, Dan Deppen, is a former aerospace engineer and product manager who transitioned away from cubicle life to full-time note investing in 2018. Our website is www.fusionnotes.com, where you can subscribe to this podcast, comment, and find links to other information on note investing.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Note Investor Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Deppen, and today I'm going to be talking about some lessons learned from 20 note deals that I've exited over the last few months. I've talked about lessons learned in the past. It's something I'm kind of big on when I close deals, and so I want to always be updating the model for my note business. And originally for this podcast, I was going to put together some case studies because it's been a little while since I've put those out. And I actually have a ton of deals that I've closed that I have not built case studies for. I want to build those out on the Fusion Notes website and do some other things with them. But in the process of starting to work on those, I kind of drifted towards putting together some portfolio level data on things like returns and costs and a lot of different things that I kind of went deep down the rabbit hole over that the last few days, and I was able to pull out some pretty good insights that'll be helping me make some adjustments in my business. So one of the big things that I've been working on as well is updating my pricing model. So my ROI calculator is something that I've just updated on a regular basis for the last few years. It's evolved a lot over time. And several months ago, I put together a different version of it that was more intended to look at bidding on entire portfolios where you might have, 10 to 50 notes in them at a time. I refer to it as my turbo pricer. Which the only reason I call it that is when I worked at Oracle, we had this really fancy spreadsheet for doing estimates and pricing out storage hardware, and they called it the turbo pricer, so I've just kind of adopted that. But as I've gathered this portfolio level data, some of the insights towards, like I said, pricing and costs have been pretty unique, and so I thought it would share it here. I don't know if I've ever seen anyone share data quite like this. I'm going to share for the most part just the averages and not as much get in to the specific deals, because probably in the next podcast, if I don't have an interview, I'll cover some of the case studies, or if not, the one after that. And just one big just kind of word of warning before I start diving into that stuff is that, the data I'm presenting are averages for a number of deals, right? So one of the big takeaways from this little study is just how much variability there is in outcomes from deal to deal to deal. So, this is an average over a sample of 20 deals. When you buy an individual note, the results you get may be completely different. Part of that's just the variance. It could be that you're buying using a different model than what I'm using, or you could have a different approach to doing the workout. So I don't want anybody to take these numbers as, if you do a non-performing note or a non-performing CFD, this is what's going to happen, because it's kind of not. And the other interesting thing is that I've been able to tighten things up over time. So this sample of 20 deals, these were all initiated for the most part the second half of 2018. I've made a lot of changes since then anyways, but then actually looking at the numbers now is going to help me make a few more adjustments. And as we go along, I'll kind of talk about what I've been updating. So talking about just the data set to start off. So these were 20 non-performing notes, mostly contract for deeds. And these were all ones that I had done joint ventures on as well. So like I said, for the most part, entered into the second half of 2018. And as far as the outcomes of the 20, 9 of them became REOs that I sold either through a foreclosure or a forfeiture, which is often the process on a contract for deed, or a deed in lieu, where the borrower basically agreed to sign over the property, typically in exchange for a payment, so what we call a cash for keys deal. The other 11 was able to get them reperforming and then sold them as reperforming notes. Now the sample's a little skewed as far as the percentage of REOs to the percentage of reperforming notes. I did not go in yet and look at the data on of the non-performing notes I buy, how many reperform, because a lot of my reperformers, the partners like to just hold on to them for a while. Whereas in this sample, these are ones that I actually exited. So there are a lot more that I did in this time frame that are performing and we're holding on to. When I looked at it a while back, it seemed like there was about 2/3 or so I would get to reperform. I suspect those numbers might be a little bit higher right now, but I need to go back and look at those. So, so in here, almost half became REOs, but typically, that's not the case on a running basis. But for this data set, that's what I have. All right, so talking about some of the numbers in terms of returns, and again, this isn't to suggest that if, you buy a note, this is what you're going to get, or on my future deals, this is what I'll end up seeing. This is just results of a specific sample with kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly thrown in. If you're watching this on YouTube, I have a slide that kind of summarizes some of the numbers, but I'll try to explain it in a way that doesn't get people too lost by just rattling off numbers. So the total ROI for the joint venture partners on these, and these were joint ventures set up with a 50-50 profit split. So the investor who put up the funding for the deal got their money back first, assuming there was enough money to pay them back entirely, and then profits were split 50-50 after that. And the average ROI to the joint venture investor, this was after the profit split, was 10.9%. And then the annualized return, so there's a function in Excel called XIRR you can do to calculate the annualized return, which, if the deal runs for a while, can be a more meaningful metric. Some of these, the XIRR is not as interesting because sometimes they go fast, like if the borrower just signs off on a deed in lieu, and then whether it was a big winner or a big loser, that value gets magnified. But of the ROI, which is just the, but overall, the annualized return average was 11.5%. So fairly close to the ROI, meaning on average, these were running about a year or so, actually probably a little bit under. So not so bad. That means if, you're doing these with your own money, following this model in this time frame, you probably see around 20% returns. And I want to caution people on that because there's a lot of variability in that. And these were all ones that were really cherry picked, right? So this was doing, typically these were bought 1 to 4 at a time, often going through a large tape of hundreds of CFDs and picking the couple that looked the best. So the first big word of caution is if you look at the ROI, so we had that average of 10.9%. The biggest winner was 68%, and that was 68% after the split to the JV, so it actually made over 100%. That was one where it was a forfeiture on a contract for deed, and basically the borrower forfeited a lot of equity. The borrower, did some things that just didn't really make sense for them. The low was negative 14.1%. And yes, I have lost money on note deals. There are actually a handful of in here that went red. And I'll talk about that a little more. And when I get into some of the case studies in the future weeks, I'm going to talk about those as well. I know if you go out on Bigger Pockets or you talk to some of the gurus and things, they act as if they've never lost money on a note deal. And that's just not the case. These things are very volatile, especially when you're doing non-performers. And, you run into these situations where you can't inspect the inside of the house. You can't predict borrower behavior. And if you do enough of these, things are going to get wacky at some point. And that's something I'm actually going to talk about in a little more detail in future podcasts, because I think a lot of times some people who promote the industry kind of downplay some of the risks. Now, the overall average returns are pretty darn high, right? And it's like any other investment if you think about it, right? Like if you're buying stocks or doing other things, usually with the potential for higher reward goes high risk and more variance. And that's the same thing here, right? There's nothing special about notes that defies the laws of physics or investing. So it actually kind of makes sense if you think about it. And going forward, I want to talk more and more about that to kind of set the expectations. And, the other thing I've noticed too is I've had more conversations with some higher level folks who are running some funds and have been around for a while. I've heard some real horror stories of deals that have gone south. And these are from people who really, really know what they're doing. Now, knock on wood, I haven't had anything like that happen today, but I have had some definitely get sideways. Okay. So the next thing I kind of learned, if you break this down to the ones that reperformed, of those 11 that reperformed, the return to the JV partners, this is again after the split, was about 12 to 25% on an annualized basis, which is great. So what kind of happens here is, if you can get it reperforming, assuming you're buying at a decent price, when it's non-performing, those times you do get them to reperform and get them back on track, you can do really, really well. And the rub is when that doesn't work and you take the property back, that's when things get dicey and get all over the place. So my next point here was in these scenarios where you end up with an REO, the returns are just all over the map. In fact, my high and low ROI examples, that 68% after the split, and then the negative 14%, those were both scenarios where I ended up taking the property back. And it was actually the same partner I was working with on both of those as well. And the other reason I want to make people more tuned into some of the, the risks with these and understand what can happen is those are with the same partner. And we got the 68% first, which was the massive home run. The minus 14% came some number of months later. Net partner was doing great, but was not happy at all when that minus 14 came out. And I think some of that is on me for not necessarily setting the expectations and the, kind of educating folks on what can happen with these. And again, I'll do some case studies on those down the road. One of the big takeaways for me though is not moving to, I'm going to continue to do joint ventures, but as a lot of people know, I have the Fusion Income Fund now. By doing a fund model and doing these in large groups, you're tamping down that volatility, right? So there's going to be a 10, 11% return overall. And within that, there are going to be some that are kind of steady, some that are home runs, some that go red. It all kind of washes out when you do it in that model. Note investing, I'm increasingly convinced, is more and more and more of a numbers game. So if you can build a good model, scale it efficiently, do a lot of notes, then you can kind of let the numbers work their magic. If you're just doing one or two, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But, the actual results you get just could be all over the map. They could be amazingly good. They could be amazingly bad. And I don't just want to cherry pick the good ones. I want to try to give folks all the data. There were no exits in this time period that I threw out or anything like that. So moving on now to talk about when I was selling these 9 REOs and some of the data around those. One of the things I wanted to look at, so one of the things I'm doing, right, is I'm collecting this data and I want to feed it into my pricing model. So when you look at the selling costs, so the price that I sold the property for versus the net proceeds after the sale, after realtor commission, taxes, and other closing costs, was about $3,800 overall. And it worked out to about 9% of the selling price, which isn't too bad. I had always assumed that it was going to be 10. That was kind of a rule of thumb that I've used. But the thing to point out is that when you have sales where the home sales for $25,000 or less, since some of your commissions can be kind of fixed, then your selling costs end up being like 20 to 25% in that case. And that's why I don't target assets they're going to sell for $25,000 or less. But in some of these cases, got nasty surprises on the inside, and that's where they ended up. The other thing is I've started to do more just private party sales versus using a realtor. My model's been typically, when I get an REO, just try to get rid of it quickly, just list it with a realtor, usually the one who did my BPO when I was working with, and have them take care of it and get rid of it and sell it to a cash buyer. That is fine, but you can save a lot of money on those selling costs by kind of doing it yourself. I did one recently that was not in this sample because I haven't exited the deal yet, but I did seller finance. Just put an ad on Craigslist and put an ad on Facebook Marketplace and sold it for my full asking price, which was a lot more than what my realtor was suggesting I do. And I did way better. So that's one of the areas where I'll be able to improve my exits a little bit. Now, the next piece of data that you might find scary, and it's, this has been surprising to me versus what I was assuming when I did most of these deals originally. So I wanted to look at what was the sale price of the property compared to the BPO value that I had when I bought the note. So I typically pull a BPO and it gives you a 30-day quick sale value, and then usually it gives you like a 60 to 90-day list value. Over the sample of these, the sale price was averaged about 60% of my BPO value. Think about that for a second. So that means, if I had a BPO of $40,000, my sale price was like $24,000. And that's pretty bad. I was not assuming it would be that low, and I'll explain why I think that is. Now, there was a lot of variation in that value as well, because there's a lot of variation in the inside condition when you get these things back. I sold these anywhere from 19% to 100% of the BPO. The one that was 19% was actually the one that had the minus 14% return to the investor. And on that one, I had a BPO that was $103,500 and sold it for, I believe it was $20,000. And, that was probably the other reason the partner was mad. They were basically like, how the hell does that happen? And I kind of wanted to know the same thing. Basically, the outside of the house looked fine. There wasn't like junk in the yard, and it wasn't, pristine, but it didn't look bad. But we got in there. The inside of the house was just absolutely trashed. It was really a mess. They had animals in there. It turned out somehow there was only one bathroom. There's supposed to be two. And it was actually a sad situation because they actually had kids in there and stuff. It was pretty bad. I think the BPO was bad to begin with, but there were just a number of factors. But it's just kind of so on one hand, it's a cautionary tale of what can happen when you take a property back. On the other hand, it wasn't that big a loss, right? I mean, think about it. If you do other forms of real estate deals and the value of your property is less than 20% of what you thought it was, you're probably going to lose a lot more than 14%, right? So that's one of the nice things about notes is you're buying these things at a discount. You have a lot of weasel room to maneuver and deal with that volatility. Okay, so again, sale price about 60% the value of my BPOs. And then the net proceeds as a percentage of the BPO. So I'm selling it for 60% of the BPO, and then I've got, my selling costs, commissions, taxes, whatever. That was about 52%. Okay. So basically, if my BPO is $40,000, that means when I got the property back and sold it, I was netting about 20, a little over 20. And again, with a lot of variation in there, but it's just a good example of, some of the caution you want to have. I'll point out too that a lot of these are contract for deeds with sub $100,000 BPO values. So, those tend to go upside down sooner. The other thing that affected these is a lot of these I just wanted to sell quickly, and I was selling them often to local cash buyers. Your local cash buyers, just aren't going to pay a whole lot, but because often the condition is rough, I didn't want to mess with a retail buyer. And, those cash buyers are often looking, if they're flippers or whatever, a lot of them will use a formula that's like 70% of the ARV minus repairs, and then there's a lot of repairs, and they don't want to end up offering you that much. However, as I've started doing more seller finance, that really opens the aperture on who you can sell to, and you can often get a much better price. So those are some of the ways I've been kind of adjusting things. So my typical selling costs were about $3,800, but I think with some of the, adjustments I'm making ongoing, I'm going to assume it's probably about $3,000, because I'll still use realtors for a lot of these. Certain cities, I have some really amazing realtors, but other areas I don't. And then I'm also going to assume net proceeds of about 60% of the BPO. And the reason I think I can go to 60% versus the 52 is part of this is by, just doing these private party sales and offering seller finance and dealing with fewer cash buyers who are going to not be willing to pay as much. So the expenses for deals going into the REO. So one of the things I do on every deal is in QuickBooks. When I'm doing my accounting, I've got an account for the note itself, where I track the purchase price of the note and then subtract principal payments. But then I've got another account for all of the holding costs for that note. So what I did was I looked at those 9 where they ended up as REOs, either through the foreclosure, forfeiture, or deed in lieu. And I looked at all of the costs together. So I included, servicing, forced place insurance, clean out expenses. If there was a clean out, this was kind of everything but those selling costs and commissions at the end. And if there was a cash for keys deal, then that cash paid went into these as well. If there were delinquent taxes, that went into this number. And that average overall was $7,250, which is about in line with what I had anticipated going in. Now, there's obviously variation state to state and whether you can do a forfeiture or whether you can do a foreclosure in what your legal expenses are going to be and your timelines. But this is where it averaged out. And there was a reasonable amount of consistency. There was one that was a little over 15,000 because I had to do, I believe it was 4,000 or 5,000 in rehab on that one, and it was a little longer legal process. However, since then I've made, some changes. There was a servicer I was using for some of these, which was very expensive. And I was using them to do the workout, and it drug things out longer. So by having these at Madison and Allied, I cut down a lot of that cost and cut down the timeline. I've also got better networks on the ground. So I have a better network of realtors and property managers in at least a number of cities. And then I've also gotten better at using Craigslist for some of the random jobs that you need done, like clean outs. and other things. So the 7,250 going forward, I'm going to assume that's probably going to be about 7,000. And I think that's pretty reasonable. I can probably knock it down lower than that by just being more efficient in my operations and in the vendors that I'm using. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, I have a kind of an eye chart set up, but I'll talk to what I was doing here. What I wanted to look at is, so for these deals that become REOs, if I know that my proceeds from the sale are going to be about 60% of my BPO, and my average expenses are going to be about $7,000, then what price would I have to pay for a note to break even as a function of the BPO? So for example, let's say the BPO is $20,000. I wouldn't buy one that has a BPO of $20,000, but let's say we did. Well, if it's the BPO is $20,000 and my proceeds from sale are 60% of that, that means I'm at a net $12,000. And if my expenses were $7,000, then that means I've got $5,000 left to play with. So if I want to break even on that deal, I better not pay more than $5,000 for that note, which works out to about 25% of the BPO. Now that's to break even. That's not, to make profit, right? If I wanted to make a 20% ROI, I would only be able to pay $3,000 for that $20,000 BPO property. Now I'm ignoring the unpaid balance, which obviously matters if we're getting this reperforming. I'm just looking at this from the standpoint of the scenario where the property is going to become an REO, right? Because obviously one of the things you're going to should be doing in your ROI calculator is looking at different scenarios. And so this is how I'm looking at the scenarios where it becomes an REO. Now, if you're looking at one specific note, you're going to care a lot about the state that it's in and the specific legal costs there and the timelines and some other things. But if you're looking at a portfolio of 30 or 40 contract for deeds, then a lot of these averages are probably going to work out. And then with the chart, I built it out between 20,000 up to BPO of 100,000. So as an example, if our BPO is 60,000, or let's just take an easier one. If our BPO is 50,000, then our sale proceeds are going to be 60% of that. It'll be 30,000. We have 7,000 in costs. Our break-even price we can pay for the note is going to be about 23,000. And then if you want to make 20%, we're going to have to be into it for 18,000, the price of the note. And if you want to get to 40% ROI, it'll be like a little over 14,000. So it's just kind of a quick, easy way to get a ballpark idea of what your return is going to be if you end up taking the property back. And I keep harping on this, but again, there's a lot of variation. An average might be 60%, but your one deal could be 100, like I've had before. Or, hopefully you don't end up on the low end where you're selling it for like 30 or 40% of the BPO, and that can easily happen. So some lessons learned, and one of the big ones here, right, I hope you've seen, is that in the scenario where a property becomes an REO, you're not going to really realize your equity, right? So a lot of deals on paper look like they have a ton of equity. So you might see a loan with a $80,000 BPO and a $40,000 balance. And you think, wow, if I take this back, I'm going to be way better off than if it performs. And that could happen, but most of the time it's not going to, right? And the reason is, if that property is actually worth 80, usually the borrower is not going to let you capture that equity unless they have a drug problem or some issue, or they're just crazy and they do something silly, like I had one borrower do, but that was only one. But usually if the equity's there, you're not going to see it, right? But when a borrower gives up and either just signs off on a deed in lieu and says, I'm out of here, or just rides the ship down in foreclosure, they usually do that when it makes sense for them too, meaning there are problems with the property. Usually the property is wrecked. I found when I've gotten deed in lieu's, when I first started getting those, I would get all pumped up and excited. But I've kind of found that if a borrower is really quick to sign a deed in lieu, or if they've already vacated it, it usually means there's something wrong with the house for the most part. So if the borrower is willing just to hand it over quick, there's probably something wrong on the inside. That's at least what I've seen just about almost every time so far. I'll give you one example. There was one that actually took all the way through the foreclosure process. Took a little longer than it should have, but got through the foreclosure process, and I was getting ready to start the eviction process. And this was a borrower I was never able to contact. I mean, they were just completely off the grid. I knew they were living there. I had actually visited the property before, walked right in front of it, and the outside was pretty nice. All in all, actually much nicer than some of the other deals that I've done. And then after the foreclosure, we're getting ready to start doing the eviction. Borrower calls me out of the blue and says, "Hey, just letting you know I'm moving out on Saturday." Nicest guy in the world. I'm like, okay, great. Now I don't have to do the eviction. Well, when we got in there, for one, the inside was pretty trash. They had these dogs, and there was just dog smell, like poop everywhere. And, I had to take on some rehab work for that. And then we noticed later that the furnace was dead. The heat exchanger was cracked. So the furnace was toast. And I got to thinking, I'm like, this guy all of a sudden was ready to leave. It was in the fall. It was like late October, early November. This was in Indiana when it started getting cold, right? So when the furnace was dead, he wasn't going to spend whatever it was going to cost, a couple $1,000s for a furnace. And he knew he was getting evicted anyways. At that point, he was ready to go. So when he was all of a sudden ready to go, it meant something was wrong. So the other thing is, the borrowers who tend to just ride the ship down in a foreclosure or a forfeiture, those people tend to live pretty rough, right? I mean, a lot of these contract for deeds, the payments are often between $300 and $400, sometimes less, right? It's less than rent. And so somebody who just isn't going to pay anything, even on that, for a long time, they live a rough lifestyle. And so usually what you find in the inside isn't good. And so the bottom line is, you probably have, this doesn't mean that of all the notes you buy, the BPO value, the sale value is actually 60% of the BPO value. But what it means is, when the BPO value is what you think it is, the borrower is probably going to perform. And so it's never going to end up as an REO, and you're not going to see that equity. The ones where the equity is not really there because there are hidden problems on the inside, those are the ones you see. So the data can kind of fool you in a way. It doesn't mean that every BPO is off by a very large percentage, but of the ones that you see as REOs, those are going to be the ones where the BPO is the most off, if that makes any sense. So, which begs the question is, why else are these BPO values so far off? And I'll talk about some possible reasons. These aren't, I'm sure every case is different, and I can't say definitively why this is. This might be a good thing to have a realtor on to talk about. But these are some possible reasons and some of my basically speculations, I'll call them that. So one reason is, what I've noticed reviewing a lot of my BPOs is, a lot of times the realtor will deduct from the value for things they see on the outside. Like they'll say, okay, I see an issue on the roof, I see a structural issue, I see something else, and they'll have deductions. I see a broken window, whatever. And they'll make deductions for that. But they make no deductions for the inside because they don't have a view of the inside. So what they're really doing, in effect, is assuming that the inside is pristine. Whereas the inside is never pristine. I don't think the inside of my house is pristine. And like I just got done talking about, somebody who's just going to ride the ship down in a forfeiture, instead of making a $300 payment, they're not living a lifestyle where the inside is going to be tip-top. The other thing that happens sometimes is, you do get bad realtors who use bad comps or don't understand the neighborhood. when I first started getting some data a year ago plus on these, when I started taking these back and realizing how different they were from the BPOs, I started pulling 2 BPOs for a little while, and sometimes I would get 2 BPOs and they would be radically different. I mean, sometimes like really far apart. And then I would call the realtors back and ask them about it. And there was one case in particular where I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think one had a BPO value of like 80 and the other one was saying like 25 or 30. And I was like, whoa, what's going on? And I called them both. And the one with the low value really knew the neighborhood. And she was like, well, there's this steel factory. I forget what it was. There was some kind of factory nearby. There's 3 other houses on that street that are boarded up. And there's this and there's that. And you could tell from talking to her that she knew what she was doing. So I trusted her value and actually ended up canceling that offer. The other thing that I think is a possibility, I'm sure it happened somewhere. I don't know that this has ever happened, but if your realtor has a conflict of interest, you're not necessarily going to know, right? Especially if you're selling to local cash buyers in a market that you're not really active in. There's the possibility that the realtor comes back and says, gee, this has been on the market for a while and I've only got this one offer. And, how do you know that it's not their buddy or even another LLC that they have an interest in? I'm not saying that's ever happened. I don't think it has, but I have had some interactions with realtors that I didn't trust. So I think there's a potential for it. I'm not saying that's something that happens all over the place. And that's where too, just in some cases selling these on my own and doing it through seller finance and getting away from the cash buyers eliminates some of those concerns. And like I just talked about, the reason they're bad is I kind of just already beat this to death, but the borrower is more likely to let the property go if it's in bad shape, right? So the assets with bad BPOs, those are the ones you see as REOs that you end up selling. The ones that had good BPOs, they were going to perform. You're never selling that property anyways, except in some just rare cases where the borrower does something that is kind of irrational, which can happen, but it's not common. Okay, so what adjustments have I been making over the last 18 months? I've talked about some of them. A little bit of it is avoiding certain servicers. Using the wrong servicer can be very expensive and also increase your timeline unless you are a really large fund where you can kind of hold the stick to them. I'm not going to name names on any of them, or at least any of the bad names. But the ones that I've been using who have been very good to me are Allied and Madison's been good. And I've got one at Main Street that's been good. So you want to be a little choosy about getting the wrong servicer, and depending on them can be a mess. But if you have the right ones and take a lot of things in your own hands, it can work out better. One of the adjustments I'll be making too is probably just relying more on photos of assets and doing my own comps than the BPOs. I had Justin Bogert on a while back. He was talking about how he tends to just do his own instead of relying on BPOs. Now, as I've got a pretty decent sample size and dug into my own data, I can see why he ended up doing that. I may still pull some BPOs here and there, but I'll probably be relying on them less. Since there's going to be that much variation and that much difference in selling price, I can use other methods to probably be just about as accurate overall, although I'll probably still want to talk to realtors and have somebody lined up on the ground. Doing more off-market sales and seller finance. Had Tracy Rui on a while back too, talking about seller finance, and I took a lot of the things she said there to heart. And now that I've started to do that, I think you can just come out way better. Getting away from the cash buyers, you really open the aperture on the number of people that you can sell to. You can get better pricing because you're basically selling on terms, right? So now the point of price comparison for the buyer is more the payment on the new note that you're creating compared to what it would cost to rent a place, right? versus, some kind of fix and flip investor who's, got a tight situation where they're going to be very, very price sensitive. I'm also, becoming more cautious on deals that are likely to end up as REOs. So what I haven't talked about here, and I've got some more analysis to do here, is looking at, which deals are more likely to end up as REOs. So some of these that were reperforming were not that far behind. Although they were non-performing, were not that far behind, had a lot of payments in the last 12 months. A lot of mine that became REOs, I kind of knew were going to be REOs going in. I either bought them when foreclosure was about to start. And I did these as kind of one-off deals. But I'm still going to do them when they make sense, but I'm going to be a little more cautious. And the other thing that I kind of knew already was especially if you're looking at lower value assets that may be in REO, you need to be super, super cautious because of what I was talking about before. When you look at your proceeds being 60% of BPO, and then you might have $7,000 in costs, you can get in trouble real quick if the value is low. And then the other thing that might make a good topic for a future podcast is using I don't know what the right word is, but call it a probabilistic pricing model, or doing more of like a Monte Carlo analysis. So I've been doing this for a while actually, but I've been refining it based on some of my data. So how when you do an ROI calculator, you look at different scenarios. What I'm doing is, I'll look at different scenarios. I'll look at the ROI for those scenarios, and then look at, based on the loan characteristics, what's the probability that it becomes an REO, and what's the probability that it reperforms. Right? And then you use the return for each and the probability to come up with the expected return. And again, within an individual deal, you're going to have a lot of variation. But if you do that over a portfolio, you can start to get a lot more predictable results overall. So that's something I've been adjusting. I'm going to continue to refine that as I move along. That was an analysis of the last 20 deals that I've looked at. If you guys have other information you're looking for, other, kind of statistics and things, let me know. You can always drop me an email at dan@fusionnotes.com. And kind of the last thing I'll wrap up with, I haven't talked about this a lot on the podcast. I need to do some other podcasts on this subject as well, is my systematic due diligence training course. So I put this together at the end of last year, because as I was selling a lot of these reperforming notes, I had a lot of buyers who were kind of first-time note buyers struggling with the due diligence process. And a lot of times I was just helping them with it. And in some cases, they would walk away from a deal just because they weren't comfortable and they didn't know how to do it. And sometimes even when they took some very expensive training courses. So what I did was I put together just an online training course. So it's about 7 hours of videos. But then it's got all my spreadsheets and automation tools that I use for due diligence. And so you can kind of follow a cookie cutter process to do due diligence on first position residential notes. And then I've also got a private Facebook group as part of that. And I've been doing regular updates to the course as we go along. So it's starting to develop a kind of cool little community. It's been a lot of fun. And again, there's a lot of details, and you can get the actual spreadsheets and stuff in there. So it's only $4.95 for the course. And then I've also got it set up now where you can pay that over. You can do payments over 6 months if you want. So if you have any questions about that, you can either go to systematicduediligence.com, and there's also a link to it on fusionnotes.com, or you can just drop me an email at dan@fusionnotes.com, and I can send you some information on that. So, all right, thanks for listening, and I will catch everyone next time. Thanks.